So welcome everybody. Particularly very warm welcome if this is your first Tuesday night. Very warm welcome to you. So this is the first. If this is your first evening here, you've joined at a sort of auspicious time because this is the first of a series of Sangha night talks, series of Sangha nights on a particular theme. What we tend to do is we have a theme which runs for a whole year. Anyway. So we'll be doing this from now till next September or something, or next September or October. And what we decided to do for this year, and this might strain, you might think this will strain our ingenuity, we are going to look at the Dharma through images, symbols and stories. Symbols, stories and myths. So, well, why? You might be asking yourself, why on earth would we do that? Well, because symbols and stories and myths can be a way of getting at deeper meanings than can be conveyed by words and rational ideas. But if that sounds like mumbo jumbo to you, don't worry, because we're not going to completely abandon the rational. We're going to have lots of nice rational Buddhist lists. We're not going to abandon reason. We need reason in the spiritual life. We definitely need reason. We need our intellect. But approaching through symbols and stories and myths can also give us a way to sometimes sort of just open up other areas of intuition of sort of deeper meaning. And also, not only are we going to include the intellect, you'll be glad to know, we're going to make it usable as much as we can. I mean, so we're not presenting the Dharma for academic interest. The whole purpose is to help us to bring the Dharma into our daily lives. So to find deeper levels of meaning in our daily lives, to uncover our own deep potential. So we're not going to be just telling nice stories and giving dharmic lists. We're also going to be connecting that with, well, what do we do? What do we do in order to move forward? What do we do in order to live more meaningful lives, to grow and develop? So for the rest of the year, that's what we're going to be doing. And it's my job to introduce it, so I've just done that. But also, we're also looking at a subsidiary theme as well. So we've got this big theme of symbols and stories, and we've got a sub-theme as well. And the sub-theme that we're looking at, which we're not quite sure how long will go on for, but probably for quite a long time, knowing us, the sub-theme is something called the system of spiritual development of the Triratna community, or the 5 great stages of the spiritual life. This is something that comes from a very traditional Buddhist teaching, but it's something that Sangha has sort of made his own. He initially introduced it as a system of meditation, and then it became, well, it's a system of practice. It's a system of practice which follows the 5 great stages of the spiritual life. So we're going to be looking at symbols, stories, myths that illustrate, bear down on these 5 great stages of integration, positive emotion, spiritual death, spiritual rebirth, and of course this last one, receptivity, which is sometimes put right in the middle because it's part of all of them. So don't worry if you don't understand what on earth those mean, because we'll be going into them. Since we're looking at the Dharma through symbols and stories and myths, I'm going tonight to use a modern myth. I'm going to use a modern myth to try and illustrate these different stages of the spiritual path. So, okay, first of all, what about this list? The 5 great stages, the 5 stages of the spiritual life, or the system of practice of the Triratna community. Well, okay, very briefly, the first one, integration. So, to develop spiritually, we need to become a whole person, not a fragmented, fractured person. Not a divided person in conflict with ourselves. That's what integrated means. It means brought together, whole. So we need to get to know the whole of ourselves. We need to get to know the whole of ourselves, and we need to bring all those different parts of ourselves together into a harmonious whole. so that they're all pulling in the same direction, so that we're not pulling in loads and loads of different directions constantly in conflict with ourselves. That's the meaning of integration, the first of these stages. Then we also need to become a person who's motivated by positive emotions, like metta, compassion, gratitude, rather than someone who's motivated by negative emotions, like resentment and anxiety. If we're stuck in negative emotions, there'll be no growth. So we need to do whatever we can to cultivate positive emotions and to weaken negative emotions. So that's the second stage of the path, if you like. Those two are the sort of foundation of the spiritual path, which is why there's a sort of line drawn there. But then if we're going to change in a positive direction, we need to be willing to let go of our old idea of ourselves. We've all got an idea of ourselves. We've got ideas and opinions and attitudes that we cling on to as sort of part of our self-image. But we need to be able to let go of those so that a newer and a different self can emerge. So in a sense we need to die. The old self needs to die a bit. We need to let go of our old idea of ourselves. And that's going to seem like a spiritual death, actually. That's going to seem like a bit of a death. But we need to do that to allow something new to emerge. So we need to take on board that idea of sitting a bit loose to our conception of ourselves and our views and our attitudes. And if we're willing to do that, then something new can emerge, so we can experience spiritual rebirth. So a new self, a new greater, more expansive, larger self can emerge if we're willing to let the old self go. And that brings in the need for receptivity at all these stages and as an end in itself. Spiritual change, spiritual rebirth is not something we can sort of make happen. So when we become a new self, our old self can't imagine what that was going to be. It's like really stepping out into the unknown. Our old self can't make it happen. It can't bring the new self into existence. So we need to be open and receptive to a new self that may seem to come from beyond anything we're used to. It may seem to come from outside. Anything that we associate with ourselves as we are now. And we need that receptivity also at all the other stages of the path. For integration to happen, we need to be receptive to finding out new things about ourselves. We need to be open to acknowledging our depths and our heights, for example. And similarly with positive emotion, we need to be receptive. We can't make it happen, we have to open up to it. So this receptivity comes in at every stage. So that's just a very brief sort of introduction. I'm going to go into this a bit more. But what I'm going to do is go into it a bit more using this story, using the story of the Lord of the Rings. First of all, just something about the overall thing. Because this is this system of practice, these 5 great stages, they describe something universal. They describe a universal quest, a universal journey. Which is why these great stages crop up in the myths and stories of cultures all over the world, all sorts of different places. So in my view, Buddhism allows us to take that journey faster and further than any other sort of spiritual tradition. But people all over the world have a deep sense that developing themselves according to this system, according to these stages, is what makes a true meaningful human life. And because these elements crop up in, as I say, give meaning to people's lives all over the world, and crop up in myths and stories all over the world. So I'm going to illustrate this with a modern myth that quite a lot of us are aware of, and some of us will love, and some of us I know will absolutely hate, which is the Lord of the Rings. Okay, a modern myth, a modern mythical story. So quite a few of us around this place are Lord of the Rings aficionados. But if you're a Lord of the Ringophobe, well, forgive us. And just listen, because it wasn't about that. Because it could be a different story, actually. It could be a different story. So if you think this is puerile rubbish, bear with us. You might find that it's not. And I should say that I am going to be talking, my illustrations are going to be taken from the book, not the film. The film skims over most of the deeper, more symbolic elements and favours lots and lots of action and special effects, which of course is what film does well. But it doesn't really bring out the sort of the more spiritual stuff, the deeper stuff. So first of all, okay, the Lord of the Rings. I'd better give you a brief plot. There may be people here who've spent the last ages in jail or somewhere where you haven't had access to the Lord of the Rings, so I need to give a brief plot, okay? So the brief plot of Lord of the Rings. Okay, the main character is one Frodo Baggins, okay? A member of a class of being called hobbits. And hobbits are amiable and friendly enough, they're very charming, but they are very self-indulgent, especially when it comes to food and drink. They have a very limited view of the world, and if they can avoid any sort of challenge, they will. They always prefer comfort and security to challenge and adventure. If left to themselves, they just live a very cosy, comfortable life, and they don't do anything at all remarkable if they can help it. And they are also deeply conventional. Hobbits are deeply conventional. They distrust anyone out of the ordinary, and they dislike anyone whose view of the world is bigger than theirs, and they avoid them. They're a bit like the nicer sort of Daily Mail reader. But by chance, Frodo the Hobbit comes into possession of a great magical ring. A ring that gives immense power, but which corrupts and corrodes the character of anyone who uses it, especially if they use it for selfish ends. And the Dark Lord, Sauron, is desperately searching for this ring of power. And if he gets it, it will allow him to enslave the world and plunge the world into an era of darkness and terror. And the only way to defuse this threat is for the ring to be destroyed. And the only way the ring can be destroyed is to throw it into the fires of the cracks of doom on Mount Doom, the volcano, in the dreadful land of Mordor, the home of the Dark Lord. And only Frodo can do this. Only Frodo, the unremarkable hobbit, can do this, because the ring would destroy anyone else who owns it. He can't just give it away. It would destroy him. He's stuck with it. To give it away would be a terrible act, if you like. So in all conscience, he can't give it away. But making the long journey through the wilderness to Mordor, with all sorts of terrible creatures out looking for him, and then sneaking into the terrifying land of Mordor, and then climbing Mount Doom, is a challenge about 1,000,000 times bigger than any hobbit in history has ever even considered doing. He just thinks this is impossible for the likes of us. But Frodo sees that he's just got to try and do it anyway, or the world is doomed. He doesn't really think he's got any chance of succeeding, but he sets out. So Frodo sets out to take the ring to Mordor and get rid of it. And he passes through some absolutely terrifying, hair-raising situations and challenges. And he passes through periods of really horrendous suffering that are completely beyond anything he thought he could cope with. But with the help of the magician Gandalf and his faithful servant Sam, and a host of other characters, including some other very archetypal mythical beings, and also with the help of resources he discovers in himself that he didn't know he had, he eventually does manage to throw the ring into the cracks of doom, expecting to die as a result, fully expecting to die as a result. But he and his faithful servant Sam, when they're on the edge of this volcano, with the volcano erupting, earthquakes going off everywhere, the world apparently ending, he's saved. He's saved by eagles who come and get him. And the destruction of the ring destroys the power of Sauron, which removes a shadow from the world and ushers in a new golden age in Middle-earth. So the world is transformed for the better, and order and harmony reign. And Frodo becomes a figure of great renown among the great people of Middle-earth. And eventually he returns to the parochial narrow world of the hobbits. He returns a completely different person. He goes back a completely different person, a hugely much bigger being. And the hobbits in Shire tend to think that he's mad, and they avoid him if they can. He's different, they don't like him. But his friends, and anyone of wisdom in the world, the ones of the bigger world who know things, the ones who really matter, they know that Frodo has become a truly remarkable person who everyone owes a huge debt of gratitude to. He's been transformed, and the world has been transformed. So that's a very brief outline of the main plot line of Lord of the Rings. There's a lot more goes on than that. So this story of Frodo and the Ring became immensely popular, and it's still very, very popular. Not just because it's very well written, which it is. I mean, most fantasy novels are rubbish, but this is good. This is well written. But also because it's a modern example of a type of myth that exists everywhere, that there are human beings. Because it encapsulates something of central importance to human life. It encapsulates the myth of the journey or the quest, through which a character overcomes all sorts of challenges to become the sort of person they could be. And in the process, they transform themselves, but they also transform the world into a better place. And it's this journey, or this quest, that Sangha system of spiritual development, 5 great stages of the spiritual life, describe. Okay? So let's look at some different aspects, okay, of the system of spiritual development, see how they crop up in the Lord of the Rings. So first of all, integration. Okay? Integration. Becoming a whole person, your own boss, rather than a bundle of conflicting desires and energies pulling in different directions. How is that depicted in the Lord of the Rings? Okay. Well, okay, one feature of integration, the sort of start of integration, is owning up to and getting to know our own darker motivations and our grungier energies that we don't want to admit to. So most of us think we're nice people. We're really nice people. And we turn a completely blind eye to our own darker side. Our greed, our ill will, our competitiveness, our sneakiness, our aggressiveness, and so on. We see these things in others with crystal clarity, but they don't exist in us. We think we are uniquely pure and everything is everybody else's fault. Okay? That's the sort of normal human condition. I'm all right, but what about them? So a really standing example of this that we see over and over again is when we teach people the Metta Bhavana. We teach in the 4th stage, put someone you're having difficulty with, somebody perhaps you even rather dislike. And over again, people say, well, there's nobody I dislike. There's nobody I have difficulty with. And over again, if we talk to those people 6 months later when they've been doing the Metta Bhavana for a time, like people are jostling with each other to get into their 4th stage of the Metta Bhavana. They're having fights about it. But usually we think, no, there's nobody I don't like. And you think, well, actually, actually. Is that strictly true? Or I'm really cheesed off at them and them. And there could be people we're quite close to. We just don't own up to our own emotions if it doesn't reveal us in a particularly good light. And while we're not aware of our own darker side can rule us from the shadows. But when we become aware of our darker side, we start to have some choice in the matter. We can override our darker side and start to base ourselves on our higher values and our higher principles. And also, a lot of our energy is tied up in drives that we don't want to own up to. And if we just try and cut them off, we cut off our own energy. To be potent, effective individuals, we need not just to be able to veto our darker energies and say no, we need to actually get them on our side. For example, we might need to use the energy of our aggression to overcome the things that are really in our way, the things that are our real enemies, rather than turning it into ill will and blame against people, for example. The dark side we don't want to own up to can be a real help to us. We need it as a helper. And this relationship with our dark side is portrayed in Lord of the Rings through Frodo's relationship with a creature called Gollum. So Gollum was a hobbit, like Frodo once, so he's very closely related to hobbits. But he once owned the dreadful Ring of Power, and he fell under its influence. He used the ring for trivial personal ends, and it has corroded his character. It has corroded his character. Gollum is what Frodo could become very easily. He is everything ugly and dark in Frodo. All the nasty little seeds that could grow in Frodo are blossoming in Gollum. So Gollum is full of craving. He's precious. He's full of craving. He's sneaky. He's dishonest. He's resentful. He's self-pitying. And so on. And Gollum follows Frodo during his quest because he's attracted by the ring. He wants the ring back. But he's dangerous and he's tricky. He's really dangerous to have around, and Frodo could kill him. Frodo could kill Gollum and have done with this danger. But instead, out of compassion and the recognition that Gollum isn't completely different from himself, there's a lot of kinship between the two of them, Frodo cannot bring himself to kill Gollum. That would be the sensible thing to do, but Frodo can't do it. So instead, he hasn't got any choice. He can't kill him, and he can't get rid of him because he keeps following him, so he enlists his help. He enlists his help in finding his way to Mordor. And in fact, Gollum is a great help. Gollum is a huge help. Frodo could never have done it without Gollum. He could never have found his way to Mordor without Gollum. He could never have found his way into Mordor over the terrible mountains without Gollum. But of course, Gollum is completely untrustworthy. So if you can't see him, he's up to something. If you can't see him, behind your back, he's double-crossing you. So you've got to keep him in. You've got to keep your eyes on him. You've got to keep him in awareness, if you like. If you keep him near, if you keep him in your conscious awareness, and if you're kind to him, he can be a great helper. You couldn't get there without him. And in fact, Frodo is kind to Gollum, and Gollum almost is that close to turning over a new leaf and being healed, or starting to be healed. He almost becomes a loyal servant to Frodo. But one of the things that really stops that happening is that Frodo's other loyal servant, Sam, hates Gollum, and he isn't at all kind to him. He's really nasty to him. So Gollum is encouraged to carry on being resentful and sneaky, which he does with great effect. Okay? So that's an example, I think, from the Lord of the Rings, of the part of integration involves getting to know our less likeable parts that we usually don't want to own up to, even to ourselves, and getting them on our side, using them. They can be great helpers. And another example of a different aspect of integration in Lord of the Rings is portrayed in the relationship between two members of the company that set out with Frodo from Rivendell to go to Mordor. And those two are Gimli the dwarf and Legolas the elf. Okay, so the company that go with Frodo are chosen to represent, it says, all the free peoples of the world. So in a sense, they represent all the different aspects of being human, if you like. They represent loads of different ways of being a person. Gimli is a dwarf and Legolas is an elf. And there are lots of others. But to be effective, all these different aspects of being a person have to cooperate. They have to become one fellowship. They have to stop being in conflict and come into harmony. So Gimli is a dwarf, and dwarfs are rough, rugged, practical creatures of the earth. Okay? They often live underground. They mine metals. They're skilled in making things. They have incredible strength and endurance. They are solid and tenacious. And they're tenacious both in their grudges and in their loyalties. They are hard, rough, and aggressive. Whereas Legolas is an elf. And elves are ethereal, refined beings, light as air. They can tread over snow and they leave no footprints. They're into music and poetry and the beauty of the stars and the beauty of the living world. They have no sympathy with the sort of nature-destroying industry that dwarves go in for. And dwarves have absolutely no sympathy with the namby-pamby, self-righteous ways of bloody elves. Okay? Dwarves are rough creatures of the earth, elves are refined creatures of the air. And we've probably got a bit of both in us, usually in conflict. Dwarves hate elves and elves hate dwarves, and so it's always been. So when the Fellowship of the Ring first sets out with Frodo, Gimli the dwarf and Legolas the elf are often at each other's throats, with Gandalf trying to make peace between them. But partway through their journey, something happens to Gimli the dwarf. Against his wishes, the company goes into an elf land, whose name I can't remember now, but it's ruled over by Galadriel, the elf queen. What's it called?
Lothlorien.
Lothlorien, which is ruled over by Galadriel, the elf queen. Gimli really doesn't want to go there. But Galadriel is a mythic figure, if ever there was a mythic figure. She's a female embodiment of empathy and compassion and the power to create beauty. Galadriel can see into people's hearts. And Gimli is hostile and suspicious and resentful of her. But then he has a flash of insight, a sort of theophany. She is probing his heart. She's looking into him and she's probing his heart, seeing what's there to make sure that he's sound, that he's not going to betray the company. And he's really suspicious of this elfish magic. But then he looks into her eyes and he sees not an enemy, but nothing. He sees nothing but understanding and sympathy and love for him. And he is suddenly just completely turned around. He's suddenly completely bowled over by Galadriel's empathy for him and by her very undwarf-like, refined, angelic, heavenly beauty. In an instant, he becomes a devotee of Galadriel. Right? In an instant, he's a devotee of Galadriel. He will do anything for her. He carries a lock of her hair around with him wherever he goes to remind himself of his goddess, Galadriel. And he is immediately ready to leap into a fight with his battle axe if anyone says anything bad about her, which he probably wouldn't approve of, but there you go. So suddenly, for Gimli, the rough dwarf who hates elfishness, suddenly elfishness, refinement, airiness is not something to be hated and ridiculed, it's something to be reverent towards. He wants to be its servant. So he's completely changed in his attitudes. And because of this, his attitude to Legolas the elf also changes completely. They become firm, inseparable friends. And the two together become a real force to be reckoned with in the wars that go on in this book. When these two are together, the bad guys better watch out. Together they form something really amazing. So, as well as getting to know our darker side, our sort of inner golem, integration also involves getting to know what we could call our higher side, our more refined, airy side. Because it's not particularly socially acceptable, we don't talk about it at work or whatever, and we don't spend enough time in refined states of mind like meditation, we're often completely out of touch with what we might call the divine in ourselves. So the psychologist Jung, following on Freud sort of talked about the unconscious, all the stuff in ourselves we're just not aware of. But Freud focused on all the dark stuff in ourselves we're not aware of. But Jung came along and said, it's not just that we're not conscious of, that we repress. He also talked about the repression of the divine. We repress what's best in us as well, because it's not talked about. It's not something that human beings talk about. We repress the very highest in us. And that's what, in a way, Gimli discovers through his contact with Galadriel. And that's also a part of our integration. Discovering what's divine in us, our heights. We need to open up to our heights, to what's best in us, and allow our more refined side to guide us. We need to befriend it if we're going to become the sort of person we could be, even be reverent towards it if we're going to become the sort of person we could be. And I think that's really well illustrated by the story of Gimli and Legolas. And finally, still on integrations, in the story, Frodo becomes integrated by taking on his very challenging task rather than carrying on with his comfortable life in the Shire. Because he does that, he discovers strengths and resources in himself that he never knew he had. He becomes something quite substantial. What really makes Frodo a whole integrated being is that he makes a decision about what his life is about, and then he sticks to it, carries it through. He has a goal and a set of values that determine what he does, so he becomes a real individual. He becomes the boss in his life, rather than being blown around by every passing whim that passes through his mind, which is what tends to happen if we don't know what our life is about. We just, current mental contents become what we go with. So those are all, I think, illustrations of integration from Lord of the Rings, becoming a whole person in different ways. So the second one actually is a bit more difficult to illustrate from Lord of the Rings, because in a way it's taken so much for granted. The need for positive emotions so much pervades the book that it's difficult to pick out individual examples. Positive emotion versus negative emotion is what the book's all about. The book's a classic story of the battle between good and evil, and good is positive emotion, and bad is negative emotion. What characterises the people on the right side, on the good side, is that they're fundamentally behind positive emotions like kindness, compassion, gratitude, loyalty, delight in beauty. What characterises the Dark Lord and his servants and minions is that they're ruled by hatred, cruelty, craving for power, fear, and delight in ugliness of all sorts. It's the difference. Positive emotion or negative emotion. That's what it's all about. And the terrible power of the ring to destroy people is based on the fact that if you use it with any sort of negative motivation, the negative emotion behind that motivation becomes more and more powerful until it completely takes you over. That's what happens if you use the ring. When you use the ring, you get karma on steroids. Okay? Instant mega karma. And what makes the Frodo the Hobbit a suitable carrier for the ring is that hobbits can't really be bothered. They don't really want power over others. What they want is a good meal. They don't really want power over others, and they also have this terrific capacity for loyalty and friendship. It's the fact that Frodo carries the ring in order to help others that means he's pretty much immune to its effects. It's his positive emotion that means he can take the ring to Mordor. Without that, he'd be sunk, he'd turn into one of the horrible beings that the ring distorts. So the book's full of examples where positive emotion has a positive effect and negative emotion has a disastrous effect. Just one of those examples is the fact that neither Frodo nor Bilbo before him, that ring carrier before him, was willing to kill a horrible Gollum. Because they have compassion for him. And in the book, Gandalf, the wise magician, he tells Frodo says, well, why didn't he kill him? And he tells Frodo that it's only because Bilbo acted out of compassion that the quest has got any chance of succeeding. It's because it's being done for compassion and not from negative emotion. So this need for positive emotion is just a hard fact of the spiritual life. It doesn't matter how much we meditate. It doesn't matter how deep our understanding of Buddhist philosophy is. It doesn't matter how clever we are or how much insight we think we've got. If we don't have positive emotions like metta and compassion and gratitude towards others and ourselves and the world around us, we will get precisely nowhere with the spiritual life. We might as well not bother. We're on a pub. The positive emotions are they're central to it, just as they're central to the what makes good and what makes bad in the Lord of the Rings. And the positive emotions are somehow all related. Metta and compassion and gratitude and reverence for what's higher than ourselves and joy, they come together as a block. You can't have the joy without the others. You can't just pick the joy and forget the other regarding ones. And you certainly can't have the bliss of enlightenment without them. So it's just part of it, just one of the few crucial things we need to develop. And I'll talk a bit more later about how. And then we come to spiritual death and rebirth. So spiritual death sounds a bit unattractive. But if we're going to change in a positive direction, well, we've got to let go of old ideas about ourselves. So in a sense, we need to die. We can't have spiritual rebirth without some sort of death. And the Lord of the Rings is very, very much a story of death and rebirth. I mean, one of the most obvious examples is Gandalf, isn't it? Gandalf dies. He dies in this horrendous fashion fighting the Balrog. And then he dies as Gandalf the Grey, and he's reborn as Gandalf the White, a new higher being. Classic example. But another big example is what happens to Frodo when the ring eventually goes into the fires of Mount Doom. As far as Frodo is concerned, he is a goner. He fully expects to die. He can hardly remember the Shire that was his home. The old comfort-loving hobbit that he used to be is just a dim memory to him. And his whole experience is dominated by suffering and grief. And part of him goes into the flames with the ring. Part of his hand goes into the flame with the ring. But when that happens, poof, he sort of dies. He expects to die. But the world is transformed instead. The shadow leaves the world. The rightful king of Middle-earth returns to his throne. Beauty and harmony reign. The dead tree in the courtyard of the kings produces an offspring which grows into a beautiful golden tree. Everything becomes brighter, more intense, tastier and sweeter. Even so, Sam, Frodo's faithful companion, has been given a box of magical dust. And when they go back to the Shire, he sprinkles it around the Shire. And the Shire bursts into bloom such as it's never happened before. Everything is greener, brighter, more tasty. Even the beer is the best beer that's ever been made in the Shire. Everything, the whole world just takes on a whole new intensity and a new beauty as a result of the spiritual death of Frodo. Spiritual death and spiritual rebirth come together. Self and others, self and world, we can't separate them. When we transform ourselves, the world we experience is transformed. When we experience a spiritual death and a spiritual rebirth, the world becomes brighter and more colourful and more vivid. We experience the world completely differently, and we also start to have a transformative effect on the world around us, on other people's experience as well. We bring light and joy into the world. So the two go hand in hand, spiritual death and spiritual rebirth. And throughout this, we need this fifth one, effort, receptivity. We need receptivity right throughout it. We need to be receptive to different parts of ourselves, to what's higher. We need to be receptive, if you like, to promptings from something higher than our usual self. So, the Lord of the Rings, that's a bit about those different stages from the Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings is so popular because it describes something fundamental about the way we grow and become what we could be. It illustrates, the Lord of the Rings illustrates in a very gripping way the 5 great stages of the spiritual path that Sangha describes. And as I've said, this isn't a sort of artificial system or made up in some way. It's a description of the way things are, the way human beings grow. It's a bit like saying, well, a plant grows by first of all germinating, and then you get the seed leaves, and then you get the first root, and then you get further leaves, and then you get a stem, and then you get flowers and fruit. It's a description of the way things are. It's not some sort of esoteric thing. It's the way things happen, and our path towards enlightenment will have these 5 stages. So it will have them, first of all, in the sense that they'll be, in a big sense, that there'll be major stages that we pass through. So in the early stages of the spiritual life, we need to focus mainly on integration and positive emotion. In a sense, we need to build a whole harmonious, positive, effective personality, a positive human being. And then, having developed a healthy personality, we need to go beyond that, spiritual death. We need to leave behind having any sense of having a fixed self, fixed separate self. We have to go beyond the personal ego. And this will allow us to become something more universal. It will allow our spiritual rebirth as something more than an ordinary, healthy human being. And once this has happened, once we truly go beyond that sense of limited selfhood, it's as though the force will be with us. We'll be tuned into a stream of volition in the universe which will sort of carry us along, so that acting skillfully, growing, developing, will be something we do spontaneously. There'll be no more effort. It will be a state of responding to in a receptive way. So we can see those 5 stages as describing the major stages of the spiritual life. But we need every one of them at every stage. Even in the earlier stages of the path, when we're mainly concerned with integrating our energies and cultivating positive emotion, we need to be open to moving on from our present idea of ourselves. We need to be open to spiritual death, at least in a smaller way. And at every stage, we also need to stay in touch with our inspiration, our sense of connection to something higher than ourselves. We need to be receptive so that we can be bigger than ourselves, so that something bigger than we are currently can emerge, so that we can experience, if you like, small spiritual rebirths. So we all need to follow this path if we're going to grow. It's not some artificial thing. So how can we help that to happen? How can we help that to happen? That's what I'd like to just finish off with. So how can we cultivate integration? Incidentally, we'll say loads more about this in the coming weeks, but I wanted to just end with a few pointers. It will have to just be a few pointers. How can we cultivate integration? I'll say a few pointers. 5 pages, but I'll cut them. How can we cultivate integration? Well, the first thing that Sangha actually recommends for this is do the mindfulness of breathing. Do the mindfulness of breathing. Mindfulness, especially knowing what's going on in our own mind and our thoughts and feelings, is the key to integration. Our first job is to get to know ourselves, to be honestly aware of what's going on in our minds. That may bring us into contact with bits of ourselves that we don't particularly like, our depths. We might find monsters we'd rather not own up to. But if we befriend them, without giving in to them, those monsters might turn out to be helpers on the path, as Gollum turned out to be a helper for Frodo. Meditation may also bring us into contact with our heights. Mindfulness of breathing we may get into access concentration, dhyana. Meditation can open the door to very inspired and beautiful positive states of mind, in which highly refined and almost divine parts of ourselves start to speak to us. Like Gimli, the earthy dwarf, when he looked into the eyes of the elf queen, Galadriel, we might come into contact with heights in ourselves that we didn't know existed, which will completely transform our life. So, do the mindfulness of breathing. The second is practice the 5 precepts. This is starting to sound familiar. It's sort of what we recommend, isn't it? Practice the 5 precepts. Seeking to keep the precepts is highly integrating, because it's only when we try to live according to some values that we cherish that we find out about all the parts of ourselves that don't cherish those values, that think they're a very bad idea. So suddenly, when we try and keep the precepts, suddenly Gollum is there saying, I fancy doing something different to that. Why shouldn't we, precious? We find out who we really are. And only then can we move on. We've got him in our sights, we can move on. As long as we don't really try and live ethically, we can keep kidding ourselves that we are really rather perfect. It's only when we try and move the goalposts that we find out where we're really at. And when we do live more by a system of values that represents the sort of person we want to be, well, that's got this very integrating effect. We become more of a whole person. We're taking charge of our lives, living as the sort of person we want to be, rather than being blown around by our own petty likes and dislikes, or by what other people expect of us. We become our own person when we start to live according to values that we accept. And all the precepts, keeping the precepts has just got this very integrating effect. It's most obvious with honesty and awareness, you know. If we're dishonest to others, well, we get kidded by, if we're presenting a false front to others, we get taken in by it. We cease to be honest with ourselves. So honesty is an absolute prerequisite to integration. Similarly, awareness. If we're not aware of ourselves, well, if we don't know ourselves, we can't be integrated. But all the other precepts as well, unkindness, stinginess, craving, they tend to fragment us. They tend to cut us off from what's best in ourselves and fragment us. And lastly, we need to have a clear goal, like Frodo. Our deep potentials come on stream when we know what our life is about, as Frodo knew what his was. When we're concerned about something more important than what we're going to have for dinner, suddenly we unite behind that higher purpose. So that's an area where having a higher purpose in life, well, the Dharma, practicing the Dharma as a purpose that overrides just how we happen to feel, can have this very, very integrating effect. Then positive emotion. Well, surprise, surprise. One way to cultivate positive emotion is to do the metta bhavana. Who would have thunk it? This is really not an optional part of our practice, okay? It's not optional. For us, for Westerners in particular, with our tendency to individualism and one-sided intellectualism, the metta bhavana is a completely essential part of any effective spiritual life, or something like it, something very like it. If we find it difficult, which a lot of us do, well, we need to stick to it and we need to be creative and we need to find a way to make it work. If we just say, I don't like that practice, I'll just stick to the mindfulness of breathing, we're just avoiding a whole continent of stuff that needs to be worked on, basically. So that's one thing, do the metta bhavana. And also, positive emotion, friendship. We prioritise friendship enormously, I think for very good reasons. We need friendship with people who share our spiritual aspiration. Emotions are not something that happen in isolation. Our emotions are mainly related to other people. They happen in community with other people. We need a context, we need an environment that fosters positive emotion in us and in which we can express positive emotion. More and more metta, generosity, etc. we can be receptive to the positive influence of others. We just need friendship. We need Sangha. And finally, on the positive emotion, well, you could give devotional practice a try. Reverence for something higher than ourselves is sort of an aspect of metta, and it's part of the spiritual life. Reverence for something we recognise that higher than ourselves as we are now is part of it, and that's puja and so on as a way to develop that. Spiritual death. Okay, how do we cultivate spiritual death? No, we don't kill ourselves. Trying to stay aware that our opinions and attitudes may not be the highest things going. There might be just the teeniest element of relativity about them. We might actually have changed in the past, and we might change in the future. Is this possible that we don't know everything? Just possible. So be open to that. Be open to change. Not shut off to new ideas. Not get stuck in the idea that I am this sort of person and that is that. Firstly. So secondly, step out of comfort zones. One of the most, we stick in the areas that keep us the way we are. When we step out of our comfort zone, well, as a sort of spiritual death. One of the most powerful ways to step out of our comfort zone in terms of spiritual growth is to go on retreat. You could try going on the men's event in 2 weeks if you're a man. When we leave our old environment behind, we can begin to leave our old self behind. We're sort of, us and our environment, we keep each other the same. When we leave our old environment behind, we can leave the old self behind. We put ourselves in a situation that encourages a whole new way of being. If you go on retreat, money back guarantee, you will come back a different person, at least a bit. There will be a bit of a spiritual death and there will be a bit of a spiritual rebirth. Unless you spend the whole time in bed. So if you've not gone on a retreat, go on a weekend retreat. If you've gone on a weekend retreat, go on a week's retreat. If you've been on a week's retreat, well, you could try 2 weeks on your own. No, 2 weeks. Talk to an order member. People do go on the most amazing and the retreat that really doesn't suit them. Talk to an order member. Go on retreat. Spiritual death, spiritual rebirth. And finally, for spiritual death, reflect. Reflect on the fruits of the Dharma, the truths of the Dharma. Everything is impermanent. Everything I try to hang on to fix my identity will change and vanish like clouds. I will change and vanish like clouds. I have no fixed independent self. There is no real essential me. I'm a changing process. So I can let go. I can stop trying to fix myself. I can let something new emerge. I can be receptive. So if we do all that, if we do that and encourage spiritual death, well, spiritual rebirth will happen. But to help it happen, we need, again, to be receptive to the potentials that are trying to sort of get through to us. We need to develop a connection with what I could rather dangerously describe as our higher self. The new self that's trying to emerge. And for me, the best and safest way to do that is to develop a connection, an imaginal connection with some sort of archetypal figure that symbolises Bodhi, enlightenment, our potential, what we could become. That could be the Buddha, it could be some other figure. We need to use our spiritual imagination to connect with Bodhi, with enlightenment, with what it's possible for a human being to become. And then we need to cultivate that connection so that it starts to have some power to draw us towards it. How we do that is a whole topic for at least a talk, probably a series of talks. So we'll be exploring it later in the course, but now I'll just throw out 2 things that could help. One is taking part in puja, in devotional practice, cultivating reverence for something higher than ourselves as we are now. And the second is feeding our imagination by exploring the art forms that move us most deeply. The things that really wake up our heights and our depths. That might mean making a point of listening to the music that really moves us, or immersing ourselves in the sort of visual images that really stir up our depths or whatever. So, okay, that's a very brief sketch of Sangha's system of spiritual practice, the 5 great stages of the spiritual path, and some ways that one modern mythic story illustrates the stages of that system. And a few very brief hints of how we can tread that path in our lives, how we can make that path a reality in our lives. So over the coming weeks we'll be exploring all this in much more depth, using a variety of symbols and a variety of stories and a variety of myths from the Buddhist tradition as well as from our own Western tradition. So I hope I've at least whetted your appetite.